Fred, it's great to see you today.
Same here, Jason.
So, Fred, you spent 30 years in human intelligence with the US military. And after doing that, you are now the chairman of intelligence studies at Mercyhurst College in the United States. So, you've got a lot of experience having not only read about how Russian intelligence operates, but having actually operated against Russian intelligence. So, what's your current lay of the land? How do you see things right now? And how do you think that Russian intelligence perceives what's happening right now?
Well, I think first of all, to start off, when I started doing human intelligence was 1983. I came into the Army initially as an interrogator, and then I did all the other things you could imagine in human intelligence, and was actually in working in Berlin as a human intelligence officer when the wall fell, and coincidentally, when Vladimir Putin was working in Dresden. So what's interesting is I've had longevity in terms of monitoring what's going on in Russia at that time in the Soviet Union. So I've spent a good amount of time doing that, and I've also my wife is originally from Russia. Our youngest daughter we adopted from Ukraine, so I've got kind of personal connections in both countries as well. So just to say that at the outset, I think it's interesting to me how the Russians are basically, I think, manipulating opinion in the West through disinformation, and this is something that has gone back to the 1920s. In fact, allegedly Joseph Stalin was the one who originated the term disinformation, and it was central to the Soviet Union surviving in the early years in the 1920s. So that's part of it. Another part of it is what they do in intelligence is nothing like we were authorized to do in intelligence. They're doing assassinations, they're bombing defense contractors, going after the CEOs of defense companies in Germany, for example, uh, influencing foreign elections, and not just on the left, but also on the right. Back in the Soviet days, they would only try to manipulate left-wing political organizations. Now that's at the window. Basically, it's anybody who would, sort of regurgitate their views, they'll support financially. So they're doing a wide range of things, again, for influence. And unfortunately, I think they're being very successful through the media, what Putin used to call useful idiots, right? So people in the media that could be cultivated and be fed the storyline that the Kremlin wants to have repeated. So I think if you take that all together in a ball, what it reflects is that they're using what's known as gray zone strategy. So gray zone conflict. If you think about the old days, you think about when the United States and Japan went to war in 1941. What happened after they attacked in Pearl Harbor? President Roosevelt declared war on Japan. So we were at peace and then we were at war. That's black and white. What's happening in between is the gray stuff, right? So I think you see a lot of gray zone strategy being used, a lot of disinformation, a lot of unconventional, what we would regard as unconventional covert action, really, by Russian intelligence to support their strategic objectives.
So, why don't you build that out a little bit? Tell us more about what are gray zone operations? What do they look like? Not in the historic context necessarily, but today. How do we contrast what was 40 years ago and today?
Yeah, well, so excellent question. So gray zone really is if I want to, I have a strategic objective. So let's talk about China, for example. China wants to build islands in the South China Sea. Now, if they came out from initially and said, okay, from the very beginning, we're going to build military bases in these islands in the South China Sea, everybody in the world would have lost their minds. But what they do is they do it incrementally, right? Oh, we're building some islands there because in case fishermen run into trouble in a storm, that they need a place to go. So, in other words, you do things salami slicing, right? So it's hardly noticeable. That's really a principle of a gray zone strategy because what you don't want is you don't want the people on the receiving end to go to war with you, right? So you want to achieve your strategic objectives, but you want to do it in a less confrontational way. It's still confrontational, don't get me wrong, but the receiving power is not going to think, hey, these are my existential interests here. I have to go to war, right? So Russia is phenomenally good at doing that. Okay, so I think that a lot of the activities they have ongoing in the West, yeah, they get their diplomats thrown out of different countries, other responses from the West, but nobody's ever said we need to go to war with Russia, and they know that this is part and parcel of their strategy.
That's absolutely the case. And that's actually an area that you and I have a lot in common, which is we both believe that there's a problem. Though we might not want war with Russia, Russia seems to want a war with us and to believe that currently it is engaged in a war against us. In fact, Gary Kasparov has often said that while we worry about World War III, in the eyes of Vladimir Putin, we're World War IV. The World War III having been the Cold War, which the Soviet Union lost, and today they're trying to make some grounds with this global war, which is largely centered on disinformation, propaganda, things like this, which is much, much cheaper than hot wars. And as we've seen recently, Russia's had an amazing ability of manipulating events globally, whether it's using mercenary groups like the Wagner Group throughout Africa, whether it's trying to use migrant crisis in Europe or in Latin America. We see that Russia's had a lot of successes with this new form of warfare. What do you
Yeah.
think about all that?
I think you're spot on. I think, you mentioned the migrant crisis. One of the things that Russia, and by the way, gray zone strategy is really kind of in the purview of autocracies, right? So who has used gray zone strategies? Russia, Belarus, Iran, China. Okay, these are countries where you have an autocrat who says, here's what I want to do, go out and do it. Okay. You're not going to have leaks to the media. You're not going to have people in the media second guessing what they're really doing and why. All right. So autocrats are able to use gray zone strategy because what they say is, for example, 2015, the Russians sent around 4,000 Middle Easterners across the border into a small Norwegian town, right? So it's a town where Russia and Norway have a border, and what the Russians did, because they don't want to violate international law, they gave bicycles to the individuals and said 4,000 Middle Easterners who spoke no Russian, no Norwegian, no English. Okay, they're from another part of the world into the small town of Norway, right? So you think, okay, what's the big deal? Put your Norwegian hat on for a minute and think about it. It's a really big deal because now you've got a small town and you've now basically doubled the size of that town in the dead of winter. And these people have to be housed, they've got to be fed, they've got to be clothed, they have to receive medical care. Where are we going to put them? So it's a big burden on the receiving country. Belarus has been doing it now. Look at who Belarus borders on, two NATO countries, right? And they've been trying to push people across the border from Belarus into NATO countries for the same reason, right? So this is a classic use of the migrant. And the sad thing about it is the migrants are really just victims. They're not willing, members of the Russian intelligence or anything. They're not witting of this at all. All they know is that they've been sent across the border and told, take a bike and ride across the border, go that way. So they're really the victims in this, as are the NATO countries that are on the receiving end. So this is just how you could use migrant flows to punish Western countries. And again, it's to cause disruption, to penalize, uh, like 2007, what Russia had done to Estonia. Okay, Estonia, the government was like, well, we've got the Soviet War Memorial in the center of Tallinn. We think a more suitable location for that would be in the cemetery, right? We have a military cemetery outside of town. It's a better place for it. And the Russians like, don't do that. If you do that, and remember, Estonia at that point was already a NATO country for 3 years, right? Joined in 2004. This is 2007. And what happened? For about 2 weeks, over 2 weeks, the Russians basically shut down the Estonian economy and the government through a cyber war, right? World's first ever cyber war. So here again, they didn't want to go to actual war, armed conflict, where NATO says we're now at war with Russia. But what they want to do is they want to do things strategically that will inflict pain on their adversary, right, and to their advantage. So those are two examples of how they've done that.
It's funny you bring up the example of the Estonian one. Oddly enough, when I was a national security scholar studying in Russia, it was exactly in that period of time, and it was exactly in that period of time that Nashi, the youth organization funded by the Kremlin, was inviting people to come to Tallinn to protest. And incredibly, times were so different then that a lot of them received the necessary paperwork to be able to go to Estonia, thinking that this was just some sort of normal activity. But obviously, it's not democratic. And that's where Russia has an advantage, is that it's able to leverage these different things that we have, such as giving tourist visas or giving press credentials to foreign media, thinking that it's allowing all voices to be heard. But in fact, when we look at Sputnik or Russia Today, it's not about the news. It really is just propaganda. And so when we see a bunch of young Russians trying to come to Tallinn, it might not be so simple as them wishing to broaden their knowledge of the region or to have a greater understanding of their neighbors. Rather, they're being used as part of an operation. And in fact, they're walking the streets, which I clearly remember, handing out leaflets to people saying, "Come with us to Tallinn. Here's what you need to go." So looking ahead, though, we see in the United States today, I think a lot of people still do not appreciate how Russia is operating. Russia very frequently says things that sound good. They'll say, "Listen, your president's doing a great job. He understands us. He's really working towards peace." And we always seek peace. But we know that's a typical line going back to the Soviet Union for generations. How do you
Right.
think that the Russians currently perceive the situation in Washington?
Well, I think for the longest time, the Russians have felt that they could manipulate the American public, and this is part and parcel of disinformation, right? You identify a target audience, and your starting point really is what does the target audience already believe, right? So go back to the AIDS virus in the 1983, right? People had no idea what caused AIDS, how it came about, what it was like COVID, but a couple of decades earlier. People didn't know what to think. And the problem was there was a segment of the United States population, a sizable segment, that felt like uh, the AIDS virus was created to target black people and homosexuals, because who was dying at a disproportionate rate? Black people and homosexuals. So a lot of people already believed, hey, maybe somebody created this virus to get rid of that problem, right? Well, here's the thing: the KGB, which by the way, at the time didn't have social media, they didn't have the internet, right? In 1983, but what they did was they put a small ad in an English language Indian newspaper that, oh, by the way, they owned, and they made the assertion that AIDS was created in Fort Detrick, Maryland. It was created by the U.S. Army and it was created to kill black people and homosexuals, right? So they put that story out there. And then that got a little bit of traction, not much. And then 3 years later, there was a conference in Africa. And what happened? The Russians sent two German biologists, right? Not virologists, but biologists. But they were prestigious people from Humboldt University in East Berlin. Oh, by the way, they were Stasi agents, but that came to light years later. And they sent them to this conference and they delivered a paper saying, well, evidence shows that the AIDS virus was created. And oh, by the way, this was already reported 3 years ago in this Indian newspaper, and people in Africa lost their minds. Okay. A year later, you have Dan Rather on American television now reporting that a Soviet military publication was reporting that the AIDS virus originated in Fort Detrick, Maryland. And evidence was provided by these two German scientists, right? Who are again biologists, who are Stasi agents. And it was also reported previously in the Indian media. So long and short of it was, before social media, okay, they had actually managed to get this reported to the American public through one of the preeminent news anchors of the time in 1987. So the bottom line is they've been doing disinformation for a long time. Disinformation, by the way, it's not just a lie. It's not just to make you believe that lie. It's to make you believe nobody and nothing. Do you see you see the distinction? You understand that the average person doesn't. That's the problem. Is that disinformation? If I throw out a lie, yeah, it'd be nice if you believe it. But what I really want you to do is to really question your other sources of information. Right? It was like when MH17 got shot down in 2014. Right? Malaysian airliner flying over Donetsk. And now we find out through Bellingcat, through other sources, that it was clearly a Russian, not pro-Russian separatist or any of that. It was Russian armed forces, SAM system that had rolled into Ukraine, operating in Ukraine with a Russian crew, shot down that airliner, and of course the Russians denied it, right? But the bottom line was they had used disinformation as part of the denial. Let's throw out a dozen different stories, one more ludicrous than the next. But here's the thing: how do you, as a recipient of all this news, distinguish truth from fact? You see how that works. So this is something that they are really the world masters at disinformation, and we're on the receiving end of a very strenuous, very energetic disinformation, probably the most effective or most energetic disinformation effort that they've waged against us in the West is ongoing right now.
So, as you said, the objective is not necessarily to make the West believe that Russia's the good guy or that Putin should be the president of the United States. No, it's a little bit more simple. It's simply a form of nihilism across society, question everything, have doubts about everything, and they reject their own government. So people have more doubts about their neighbor as they do about the authorities in power. So where does it go from here? What is Russia's objective? Yes, it's to create these doubts, it's to create this confusion, it's to create this tension in the society. But where does it eventually all build up to?
Well, that's the part that worries me because I've said on social media many times now for several years that we don't think we're at war with Russia, but what Russia thinks they're at war with us. But again, it's a gray zone conflict and not a traditional, we're now at war, we're going to declare war conflict because they don't want that. They couldn't sustain fighting against the combined forces of NATO, including the United States. But here's what I think is going on is Vladimir Putin wants to restore Tsarist Russia, not the Soviet Union, because even though he was a former KGB officer, I get that, right? Remember the Communist Party? Got it. But he knows that communism was flawed. What he wants to be known as basically the rebirth of Peter the Great. He sees himself as, who also, by the way, from St. Petersburg and all that kind of stuff. So he sees himself in that role. He would like nothing better than to restore the Tsarist borders, right, and Russian influence, and all that goes with it. Because here's another thing: he's not just operating in Ukraine. Look at Georgia, right? 20% of Ukraine is occupied. 20% of Georgia is also occupied, and it took them 5 days to do it. All right. They are past masters at seeing an opportunity and then trying to seize upon that opportunity. And I think that's what they try to do in Ukraine. For example, Putin sending his troops in and telling them, hey, you don't need to carry a full basic load in your tank, but make sure you bring your dress uniform because we're going to be marching in Kiev in 3 days, right? So he was way off the mark. But the problem is, it's like punching into a hornet's nest, right? You punch into the hornet's nest and you can't just turn around and say, oops, I'm sorry, right? That's one of the downsides of being an autocrat. Autocrats have a bad track record when it comes to saying, I messed up, I made a mistake, bad on me. No, he's never going to do that. And that's what we need to understand in the United States is what his strategic aspirations are. Again, regaining that Russian power, okay, which we could have a whole separate conversation about the likelihood of that ever happening, because it's really unrealistic. If you look at demographics, if you look at a number of different factors, if you look at economically, Russia's in sad shape. Russia, in fact, is a lot like Russia in 1917. Okay, before they had the mutinies and then they had the Bolshevik Revolution. So I think that Russia right now, it's not as powerful as it wants us in the West to believe that it is. And that's a key point in this disinformation effort, right? Is to target audiences in the United States, selected audiences in Western Europe, and convince them, hey, there's no way the Ukrainians can win. We're powerful, Russia. Just look at us on the map, size comparison. How could anybody stand against us? The reality is the Ukrainians are pretty smart, crafty people, and they've actually fought the Russians to a standstill in most cases, right? So it's not exactly as the Russians depict it, but they've put a concerted effort into making us believe that it is.
Absolutely the case. Russia likes to project power. And how you remember the stories as you remember very well when the Soviet Union finally did collapse. How many Americans and Europeans finally got to go visit Russia or visit facilities of the Russian government and were quite surprised by what they saw? It was not this elaborate, massive structure as we had thought it was. It was much
Right.
more reduced, much less powerful, much more of a paper tiger.
Yes.
So going ahead, what should we expect to see next from Russia? What do you think that the next couple of years are going to look like?
Well, I think for a variety of reasons, when the Trump administration came into office, I think a lot of their attitudes about Russia and Ukraine were shaped by President Trump's experience getting um, impeached, right, because of the phone call with Ukraine and how that all played out. And I think that there are a number of people in the current administration that have an inaccurate understanding of what the nature of the conflict really is, because I think that a lot of their thinking and their paradigms are shaped by these past experiences, right? So I think this may be a wake-up call. I think there are some folks, and I've seen evidence of some of this happening within certain officials in the administration, where they're coming around and they're realizing, hey, wait a minute, yeah, the Russia really is the bad guy here. Okay, so for example, the Russians on Palm Sunday, right, bombing Ukrainian churchgoers. Okay, now, and here again, this goes back again to disinformation. This whole thing about, well, we have the Russian Orthodox Church and we are the last bastion of Christianity. Yeah, we're so Christian, we're going to bomb Ukrainian civilians on the way to celebrate Palm Sunday, right? No, that's it's inconsistent. And I think that event, by the way, turned around a lot of minds of people that are either in the administration directly or supporting the administration, right? Where they said, well, maybe these guys really are the bad guys. Okay. So I think that the more this happens, the more inclination we may have to support Ukraine, adequately support Ukraine, and not just with 31 Abrams tanks and a lot of patting on the head and some intelligence, but not enough guns and ammunition.
Absolutely. Professor Hoffman, it was great chatting with you. Thank you for your time and thank you for your service.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Jason.